Moscow, 1937. A man sits alone in his office at 3 in the morning. He is reviewing a list, names, hundreds of names. He draws a line through some, circles others, and sets the paper aside. By noon the next day, the people on that list will simply disappear. No trial, no announcement, no explanation. Their neighbors will pretend not to notice. Their coworkers will erase their names from memory. Their own families will learn to say nothing. Because the man reviewing that list has done something no ruler in history had done so completely. He didn't just control what people did, he controlled what they were allowed to think. His name was Joseph Stalin. And what he built wasn't simply a dictatorship, it was the most sophisticated system of psychological manipulation ever constructed by a single human being. 200 million people, trapped inside a machine designed to make them afraid of themselves? This is not a story about politics. This is a story about the human mind, about how fear rewires the brain, about how identity can be stolen, about how an entire civilization can be trained to lie, even to itself. And the most disturbing part of this story is that every technique Stalin used has a name in modern psychology. Stalin didn't study textbooks. He discovered these tools through instinct and trial. But researchers today recognize every one of them, because the same mechanisms that trap nations can trap individuals, can trap families, can trap communities. That is why this story matters, not just as history, but as a warning. We begin not with the gulags, not with the show trials, but with a single moment that reveals everything. 1934, the Soviet Writers' Congress, Moscow. A hall full of artists, poets, and intellectuals. A man walks to the podium. He is not tall. He is not physically impressive. He has a pockmarked face and a thick mustache, and he speaks with a Georgian accent that Moscow intellectuals once mocked. But as he begins to speak, something strange happens in that room. The applause starts, and it does not stop. 11 minutes of continuous applause. No one sits down, because no one knows who will be the first to sit, and no one wants to be that person. This was not enthusiasm. This was survival. And Stalin watched it from the back of the room, expressionless, taking notes. That scene is the key to understanding everything. If you find these hidden stories of history valuable, take a moment to subscribe to our channel, because this is just the beginning. Modern neuroscience has a term for what Stalin created: chronic threat response. When the human brain senses danger, it does something remarkable. It shuts down the rational thinking centers and hands full control to the survival centers. This is useful when a car is swerving toward you. It is catastrophic when it never turns off. Stalin understood this instinctively, not through science, through observation. He noticed something about fear. When people are merely threatened, they comply. But when they are kept in a state of permanent, low-level terror, something deeper happens. They stop trusting their own judgment. The brain under chronic stress begins to see threat everywhere. It becomes hypervigilant, exhausted, confused. And a confused, exhausted mind is the easiest mind to control. Here's how he built the system. It wasn't constant, visible terror. That would have been too obvious, too unified. People under visible, consistent oppression tend to band together. No. Stalin's genius was in making the terror unpredictable. One week your neighbor is arrested. The next week nothing happens. The week after that, someone from a different building disappears. The randomness was the point. When punishment is random, the brain cannot identify the pattern. And when the brain cannot find the pattern, it begins creating patterns that don't exist. People started to believe that any action might trigger punishment. Any word, any silence, even the wrong look on your face at the wrong moment. This is called learned helplessness in psychology, and it is one of the most effective forms of control ever documented. The man who discovered learned helplessness, psychologist Martin Seligman, did it with dogs in a laboratory. But Stalin had already proven it on a nation. In 1936, a Soviet encyclopedia was published, filled with detailed entries on prominent figures. The next year, subscribers received an unusual letter. It contained a razor blade and instructions. They were told to cut out certain pages and replace them with the enclosed corrections. The corrections were simple. They removed the names of people who had been arrested and replaced them with expanded entries on geology or agriculture or other neutral topics. People did it, quietly, without question, because the alternative was unthinkable. Control the past and you control the present. George Orwell captured this in a single sentence. He who controls the present controls the past. He who controls the past controls the future. Orwell was writing about Stalin, directly, specifically, but the psychological mechanism is older than Stalin, and it is this. Human beings orient themselves in the world through narrative, through story. We understand who we are by understanding where we came from. When you destroy that narrative, when you replace history with a version you control, you don't just change what people believe happened, you change who they think they are. Stalin rewrote photographs. He had executed officials literally painted out of official images. He rewrote encyclopedias. He rewrote school textbooks. He had his own role in the revolution expanded. His opponents' roles diminished or erased entirely. And here's the part that stays with you. People who had lived through those events, who had been present, who had their own memories, began to doubt those memories. Because when the official version contradicts your experience, and accepting the official version is the only safe choice, the brain begins the process of revising the memory itself. This is not weakness. This is the brain doing what brains are built to do, prioritizing survival. But the cost is devastating, because when you can no longer trust your own memory, you can no longer trust yourself. And a person who cannot trust themselves will look for someone else to trust. Stalin was always available to fill that role. If you had grown up in the Soviet Union in the 1930s, your very first lesson in school would not have been reading. It would have been Stalin. His portrait hung in every classroom. His name appeared in the first readers. Simple sentences. Stalin loves the children. The children love Stalin. This was not accidental decoration. It was a carefully engineered process of identity formation. Here's why it worked. The human brain is most malleable in childhood. The beliefs installed in the first decade of life become the operating system. Everything else runs on top of them. By surrounding children with a single dominant figure, by making that figure omnipresent, benevolent in language, terrifying in consequence. Stalin's regime created a generation that genuinely could not imagine the world without him. This is what psychologists call totalistic identity, a state in which the self is entirely defined by loyalty to a single external authority. The children who grew up under this system did not merely obey Stalin. They experienced doubt about Stalin as doubt about themselves. To question him felt like self-destruction, and this was reinforced constantly. There was a boy named Pavlik Morozov. He was 13 years old when he reportedly turned his own father into authorities. His father had allegedly been hiding grain. The father was arrested and executed. The state made Pavlik Morozov into a national hero. Songs were written about him. Statues were built. His name was put on schools. The message was explicit. Loyalty to the state came before loyalty to family. But the deeper message was more devastating. If a child can betray his father, if that is celebrated as heroism, then no relationship is safe. No bond is permanent. The only reliable loyalty is loyalty to Stalin. That is how you reprogram a population. Not through violence alone, but by replacing every human bond with a single, controlling relationship. If you want to understand the psychology of denunciation, start with a simple question. Why would ordinary people inform on their neighbors, their friends, their family members? The easy answer is fear, and fear was certainly part of it. But the full answer is more disturbing, because many informers were not afraid. They were true believers. The Soviet state built a system that made informing feel virtuous. You weren't betraying your friend, you were protecting the motherland from enemies. You weren't destroying a family. You were cleansing society of dangerous elements. The language mattered enormously. Stalin was a master of language. Not eloquent language, but precise language. Language designed to reclassify reality. When someone you knew was arrested, the state did not say they were arrested. It said they were unmasked. That single word carried enormous psychological weight. Unmasked means there was always a hidden face. It means the person you thought you knew was never real. And if your friend was always secretly an enemy, then your friendship was always a lie, and you owe nothing to a lie. This is a technique with a precise name in modern psychology: cognitive reframing, the manipulation of meaning by changing the language used to describe it. Stalin's state applied this at industrial scale. People who resisted collectivization were not farmers protecting their land. They were kulaks, class enemies, bloodsuckers. Scientists who questioned official genetics theory were not skeptics doing their job. They were saboteurs, agents of foreign powers. When the language changes, the emotional response changes with it. And when the emotional response changes, behavior follows. The informing system also served another function, one that was perhaps more important than the information it generated. It destroyed trust. In a society where anyone might inform on you, you cannot trust anyone. Not your coworker, not your neighbor, not your spouse. And in a society where no one trusts anyone, the only institution left standing is the state. Stalin had effectively made himself the last relationship, the last bond, the last thing anyone could rely on. This is isolation used as a governing principle. In 1936, a group of men sat in a Moscow courtroom. These were not ordinary men. They had been among the founders of the revolution, old Bolsheviks, men who had fought and sacrificed and built the Soviet state, and they confessed, voluntarily, loudly, in detail, to crimes they had not committed. They confessed to plotting against Stalin, to working for foreign intelligence services, to sabotaging industry, to planning assassinations. None of it was true. The Western observers in the room knew it. The Soviet officials running the trial knew it. Even Stalin knew it. So why did it happen? The question that haunted observers for decades. How do you make innocent men confess to crimes that could get them killed? The answer reveals one of the darkest psychological techniques in human history. It started with sleep deprivation, interrogations lasting days, rotating teams of interrogators, the prisoner never allowed to rest. When the brain is deprived of sleep, the prefrontal cortex begins to fail. The capacity for rational thought degrades. Reality and suggestion become indistinguishable. Then came the isolation. Complete removal of any human contact except interrogators. Then came what interrogators called the conveyor, non-stop questioning, no silence, no moment to think, no moment to orient. And threaded through all of this, threats against family members. The moment a prisoner showed concern for his wife, his children, that concern became the lever. You will confess, or your family will follow you. Many broke not to save themselves, but to save the people they loved. Once the confession was obtained, the show trial served a different purpose. It was public confirmation, public proof that the world was exactly as Stalin described it, full of hidden enemies, traitors wearing friendly faces. And when the accused stood up in open court and confirmed everything in front of journalists, in front of foreign observers, the message was sent to every Soviet citizen. If these men can be enemies, anyone can be an enemy, including you, including people you love. In 1973, a bank in Stockholm, Sweden was robbed. The robbers took hostages and held them for 6 days. When police finally freed the hostages, something unexpected happened. The hostages defended their captors. One woman later said she felt safer with the robbers than with the police. Psychiatrists named what they observed Stockholm Syndrome, a psychological response in which hostages or abuse victims develop positive feelings toward their captors. The mechanism is well understood now. When you are completely dependent on someone for your survival, when that person has total power over whether you live or die, the brain begins to interpret any small kindness as evidence of genuine care. Stalin understood this mechanism, not as theory, but as practice. He deployed it on a national scale. Here's how it worked. The terror was never total and constant. There were moments of warmth, celebrations, public festivities, bonuses for outstanding workers, letters from Stalin, personally congratulating heroes of labor. A woman who worked in a textile factory in 1935 received a personal letter bearing Stalin's signature, praising her output. She kept that letter for the rest of her life, even after everything, even after learning what had happened in the camps, even after learning what those years had cost. She kept the letter, because in the psychology of captivity, The one act of kindness carries more weight than all the cruelty. The cruelty is the background noise. The kindness is the signal. And when kindness comes from the person who controls your survival, it registers in the brain not as cruelty disguised, but as genuine mercy. Multiply this by 200 million people across decades, and you begin to understand why so many Soviet citizens genuinely mourned when Stalin died. 1953. The announcement came over the radio. People wept in the streets, not because they were forced to, not because they were watched, but because somewhere in the psychology of long captivity, the captor had become the protector. The source of terror had become the source of safety. This is among the most disturbing truths in this story, because it demonstrates that psychological manipulation does not feel like manipulation from the inside. It feels like reality. One of the most effective psychological tools in Stalin's system was something that took researchers decades to fully understand. He made everyone complicit, not merely witnesses, not merely bystanders, participants. Here's how it worked in practice. When a worker in a factory was accused of being an enemy of the people, the factory held a meeting. Every worker was required to attend. Every worker was required to speak, and every worker was required to condemn the accused. Not just agree with the condemnation, actively contribute to it. The person who spoke most forcefully was safest. The person who spoke with hesitation was noticed. The person who said nothing was already suspected. This did something profound to the people who participated. Social psychologists call it the foot in the door technique. Start with a small commitment, and the brain works to justify it, because the alternative is to admit that what you did was wrong, and most human minds will go to extraordinary lengths to avoid that admission. The first time you condemned a colleague you knew was innocent. It was agonizing. The second time was easier. By the 10th time, you had constructed an internal narrative that made it make sense. He was probably guilty. The state has information we don't have. I was protecting my family. And once you have built that narrative, you are invested in the system that required it, because admitting the system was wrong means admitting everything you did in its service was wrong. And that is a weight most human minds simply cannot carry. Stalin created a population of people who needed the system to be legitimate, because if it wasn't, they had no way to live with what they had done. There is a concept in linguistics called newspeak. George Orwell invented the term, but Stalin invented the reality. The idea is this: if you control the words available to describe an experience, you control the experience itself. Because human thought does not exist independently of language, we think in words, and if certain words are unavailable, certain thoughts become literally unthinkable. Stalin's state systematically degraded the language, not by banning words exactly, but by making certain words dangerous. The word freedom existed, but in Soviet language, freedom meant freedom from capitalist exploitation, not freedom of movement, not freedom of speech, not freedom of conscience. The word democracy existed, but it meant the will of the working class as expressed through the party, not elections, not dissent, not opposition. When the same words mean different things, communication between people collapses, because you cannot be sure that what you say will be understood as what you meant. And when communication collapses, people stop talking. They keep their thoughts to themselves. They speak the official language in public. And they maintain a private inner world they share with no one. This is called doublethink in Orwell's language, but its real psychological name is dissociation, the splitting of consciousness into a public self and a private self. Living in permanent dissociation is exhausting. It damages mental health profoundly. It creates a constant background anxiety, a sense that the self is always at risk, always performing, never safe to be authentic. And a population in that state is a population that uses all its psychological resources just to survive the present moment. It has nothing left for resistance, nothing left for collective action, nothing left for anything except endurance. By 1937, Stalin had begun eliminating his most capable subordinates. This seems counterproductive. Why would a leader destroy his own best people? The answer is one of the most revealing truths in this entire story. Capable people are dangerous, not because they will necessarily rebel, but because they have independent sources of authority. They know things, they have relationships, they have standing among their colleagues. A subordinate who has genuine expertise has the psychological foundation to disagree, even if they never would, even if they are completely loyal. The capacity for disagreement exists. Stalin needed people around him who had no independent foundation, who were entirely dependent on his favor, whose only source of standing was his approval. So he eliminated the competent and replaced them with the compliant. The result was catastrophic in military terms. When Germany invaded in 1941, the Red Army had been gutted of its experienced officers. Tens of millions of lives paid the price. But from the perspective of psychological control, it worked exactly as intended. Stalin surrounded himself with people who could not survive without him. People who had no identity except as his servants. People who had participated so deeply in his crimes that their only safety lay in his continued power. This created absolute dependence at the highest levels. And absolute dependence is the goal of every controlling relationship, whether between nations or between individuals. Every system of control needs an enemy. This is not a cynical observation. It is a psychological fact. The human brain under stress organizes the world into two categories: safe and dangerous, us and them, inside and outside. This is called binary thinking, and it is not a character flaw. It is an ancient survival mechanism. When your ancestors lived on the savannah, the ability to quickly sort the world into threats and non-threats was the difference between life and death. Modern humans still have that machinery, and it can be activated. Stalin kept that machinery running constantly by providing a constant stream of enemies. When collectivization failed and millions starved, the enemy was the kulaks, wealthy farmers who were hiding food, sabotaging the harvest. When industrial production fell short, the enemy was the wreckers, saboteurs inside the factories, agents of capitalist powers. When the military performed badly, the enemy was traitors in the officer corps, hidden enemies wearing Soviet uniforms. The enemy was always just identified, always just unmasked, always the explanation for every failure. And here's the psychological genius of this approach. If you are constantly being threatened by hidden enemies, you need protection. And the only source of that protection is Stalin. The more frightening the enemy, the more you need the protector. The more you need the protector, the more you will accept from him. This is why manufactured crisis is the oldest tool in the authoritarian playbook, and why it works every time. Because it exploits mechanisms that are built into the human brain. Isolation is not just a psychological concept, it is also a physical one. Stalin's state controlled information at every border. Foreign newspapers were not available. Foreign radio broadcasts were jammed. Travel outside the country was essentially prohibited. This created a closed information environment, in which the only available version of reality was the state's version. Human beings calibrate their understanding of the world through comparison. We look at what is happening elsewhere, and we adjust our picture of what is normal, what is possible, what could be different. Remove that comparison, and the existing conditions begin to feel inevitable. Not good necessarily, but fixed, permanent. The way things are and always will be. Soviet citizens who had lived through the 1920s, who had memories of different conditions, were dangerous because they had comparison points. The generation that grew up knowing only the Soviet system had nothing to compare it to. And what you cannot compare, you cannot evaluate. What you cannot evaluate, you cannot question. This is why authoritarian systems always target education first, because education is the provision of comparison points. It tells you how other people have lived, how other societies have been organized, what alternatives have existed. Strip that away, and you are left with a population that has lost the cognitive tools needed to imagine something different. There is a particular kind of psychological torment that does not require physical pain. It is induced by the systematic destruction of a person's sense of innocence. Stalin's system achieved this through a mechanism so elegant in its cruelty that it deserves careful attention. In the Soviet state, everyone was guilty of something, not because everyone had committed crimes, but because the definition of crime was designed to encompass everyone. Article 58 of the Soviet Criminal Code listed counter-revolutionary activities. The definition was so broad that any expression of dissatisfaction, any criticism, any joke, any association with someone who had been arrested could qualify. When everyone is potentially guilty, when the law is designed to catch everyone, something happens to the psychology of the population. People begin to feel guilty, even when they have done nothing. They begin to wonder what they might have said, what might have been overheard, what might have been misinterpreted. This is called anticipatory guilt, and it is extraordinarily effective at producing compliance, because the most reliable way to avoid punishment is to avoid any action that could possibly be noticed. The safest behavior is no behavior. The safest speech is silence. The safest thought is the approved thought. And a population that has internalized this is a population that polices itself, which is far more efficient than any secret police force. In 1932, a group of senior Communist Party members wrote a private document criticizing Stalin's leadership. They were not trying to overthrow him. They were trying to reform the system from within. They followed every proper channel. They addressed their concerns to the Central Committee through official procedures. They were all arrested. Most were executed. The lesson was learned instantly. Across every level of Soviet society, legitimate criticism leads to destruction. Therefore, there is no legitimate criticism. Therefore, the system is perfect. This is called the loyal opposition trap, and it is one of the most effective methods of eliminating accountability. In healthy societies, internal criticism serves a corrective function. It identifies problems before they become catastrophes. It prevents the accumulation of errors. It maintains a connection between leadership decisions and real-world outcomes. When you eliminate internal criticism, you don't eliminate the problems it would have identified. You just ensure they are never corrected. They accumulate, compound, and eventually produce catastrophic failure. The Soviet agricultural system is the clearest example. Scientists knew the official genetics theory was wrong. The theory that plants could be trained, that acquired characteristics could be inherited, was pseudoscience. Every credentialed biologist understood this. But the official theory was Stalin's theory, promoted by his favored scientist, and criticizing it was counter-revolutionary. So Soviet agriculture was rebuilt on false science. While every scientist who knew better stayed silent, millions of people starved, not because the land was bad, not because the farmers were lazy, but because the feedback mechanism that would have corrected the error had been destroyed. Every morning in Soviet schools, children recited, every public meeting began with ritual praise. Every publication opened with Stalin's name. Every achievement was credited to his wisdom. Every success was his vision made real. This was not merely flattery. It was a psychological technology. Behavioral psychologists have a name for it: operant conditioning. When you perform an action repeatedly, the action itself shapes the mental state. People who were forced to praise Stalin publicly began to feel the praise not because they were convinced by argument, but because the act of expression creates emotional alignment. This is why every authoritarian system insists on public declarations of loyalty, not because the declarations contain useful information, but because the act of making them changes the person who makes them. You say you believe, and over time, you come to believe what you say. This mechanism is now well documented in social psychology. It was used in advertising, in political campaigns, in religious practice, long before anyone gave it a formal name. Stalin used it at the scale of a nation, across a generation, and the results were as predicted. People who had spent years publicly praising Stalin could not easily reverse course when the system finally cracked, because reversing course meant admitting that everything they had said, everything they had expressed, had been either a lie or a delusion. Neither option was psychologically comfortable, and so the praise continued, long after the man was dead. When a neighbor was arrested, something else happened, something quieter, something that rarely appears in the history books. Their apartment was redistributed. Their furniture was redistributed. Their ration cards, their food allocations, sometimes their jobs. This was not a side effect of the terror. It was a design feature. The Soviet state created a system in which denouncing your neighbor could materially improve your situation. In conditions of genuine scarcity, where housing was overcrowded and food was tight, the temptation was not abstract, it was concrete. It was the extra room your family needed, the second coat for winter, the slightly larger food allocation. Economists call this incentive alignment, creating conditions in which the behavior you want to encourage is also the behavior that benefits the individual. Stalin aligned the incentives of ordinary people with the needs of the state, and in doing so, he created millions of voluntary enforcers who had personal financial reasons to participate in the terror. This is important because it explains something that confuses many people. How did so few officials control so many citizens? The answer is, they didn't have to. The citizens controlled each other. Scarcity is not merely an economic condition. It is a psychological one. Researchers at Princeton and Harvard published a landmark study documenting what happens to cognitive function under conditions of scarcity. The finding was stark. Scarcity consumes mental bandwidth. When you are genuinely worried about having enough to eat, when you are uncertain whether you will have a place to sleep, when the basic material foundations of your life are unstable, your mind cannot focus on anything else. The cognitive resources that would otherwise be available for planning, for creativity, for ethical reasoning, for resistance, are consumed by the immediate problem of survival. Stalin's state maintained a permanent condition of managed scarcity. Not absolute starvation for everyone. That would have produced rebellion. But constant insecurity, the sense that what you have could disappear, that your situation is fragile, that you cannot afford to risk what you have. This scarcity was not accidental. The Soviet economy produced significant wealth, enough distributed differently to provide genuine security. The scarcity was maintained deliberately, because a population focused on survival is a population too exhausted for anything else. This is the economic dimension of psychological control, and it explains why authoritarian systems rarely maximize economic output. They maximize control, and control is served by scarcity, not abundance. There is a document in the Russian archives, an interrogation transcript from 1938. In it, an interrogator explains to a prisoner that his wife has been arrested and that his children have been placed in state care. The prisoner had maintained his innocence through days of interrogation. He confessed within the hour. This scene repeated across thousands of interrogation rooms, across years. The use of family as leverage is among the oldest coercive tools, and also among the most psychologically devastating, because it exploits the strongest attachment bonds humans form. When you threaten a person directly, their survival instinct activates, and survival instinct can generate resistance. People sometimes become defiant when personally cornered, but when you threaten someone they love, a different response activates. The protective instinct. And the protective instinct does not generate resistance. It generates surrender. The person who will die rather than betray their beliefs will often betray anything to prevent harm to their child. Stalin's interrogators knew this and used it systematically. But there was a deeper effect, beyond the individual interrogation room. When it became known that families could be punished, when it became understood that your arrest could mean your children's destruction, something changed in the calculation people made every day. It was no longer just about your own safety. Every decision you made, every word you said or didn't say, every relationship you formed or avoided, was filtered through the question, what will this mean for my family? And the answer was almost always, say nothing, do nothing, stay invisible. In Soviet elections, there was one candidate, but people still voted. 99.9% participation rates, recorded faithfully in official documents. Why vote when there is only one choice? The answer explains one of the most sophisticated elements of the system. The act of voting, even when the outcome is predetermined, creates a sense of participation, a sense of agency, a sense that you have chosen your situation rather than had it imposed on you. And when you believe you have chosen something, your relationship to it changes. You own it. You are responsible for it. It is yours. If Soviet citizens had never voted, if the system had operated with no pretense of participation, the distance between the rulers and the ruled would have been clearer, the coercion more visible, the resentment easier to organize around. But by requiring participation, by creating the ritual of choice, The state made citizens feel complicit in their own governance. This is called pseudo-democracy in political science, but it is called something else in psychology: manufactured consent. The engineering of conditions in which people appear to choose what they have been given no real alternative to choosing. It is more stable than simple coercion, because it does not feel like coercion to the people inside it. It feels like participation. In a healthy society, there is a boundary between the public and the private, between what the state can reach and what belongs to the individual. This boundary is not just legal, it is psychological. It is the space in which the self develops, in which genuine thought occurs, in which real relationships form. Stalin's system systematically destroyed that boundary. The kommunalka, the communal apartment, was not simply a housing solution, it was a surveillance solution. Several families sharing a kitchen, a bathroom, common spaces, meant that private conversation was nearly impossible, meant that your movements were always observed, your visitors noted, your mail potentially examined, your arguments overheard. The physical destruction of private space created the psychological destruction of private self. When you know that you are always potentially observed, when there is no space in which you are not potentially seen, you begin to behave as if you are always being watched, even when you are not. Psychologists call this the panopticon effect, named after a prison design in which all prisoners could theoretically be watched at all times. The result was that prisoners policed their own behavior, even when no one was actually watching, because they could never be sure whether they were being watched or not. Stalin had turned an entire nation into a panopticon, and in that environment, the private self, the part of you that knows what you actually think, feels, believe, becomes dangerous even to yourself. People learn to stop having private thoughts, not just to hide them, but to stop having them. Because a thought you don't think is a thought that cannot betray you. Before we go further, there is something you need to understand about Stalin, the person, not the icon, not the monster of history books, the actual human being. Because understanding how he thought is essential to understanding why these techniques worked. Yosef Vissarionovich Djugashvili was born in 1878 in a small town in Georgia. His father was a cobbler, a violent drunk who beat him regularly. His mother was fiercely religious, fiercely ambitious, determined that her son would be different, would be something. She enrolled him in a seminary, training to become a priest. Think about that for a moment. The man who would later execute priests by the tens of thousands, who would demolish churches across 1/6 of the earth's surface, was trained to be a man of God. What he learned in the seminary was not theology, or rather, not only theology. He learned the architecture of belief, how to create devotion, how to build an institution around a sacred text, how to make ordinary humans feel connected to something larger than themselves. He also learned what happens to people who question sacred texts. They are cast out, shamed, destroyed. These lessons stayed with him. Every element of the cult of Stalin, the sacred portraits, the ritual recitations, the heresy of doubt, the punishment of the questioner, came directly from the model he had absorbed in his youth. He was expelled from the seminary at age 20 for what the records describe as revolutionary activity and for failure to pay fees, but there are accounts suggesting something else, that the young Djugashvili had already developed the quality that would define his entire life. The absolute refusal to accept authority he did not control. He joined the revolutionary underground. He was arrested multiple times. He escaped multiple times. He was exiled to Siberia multiple times. He escaped from Siberia multiple times. This is not the biography of an ideologue. This is the biography of a survivor. A man who learned early that the world is divided into those who control and those who are controlled, and who dedicated his entire existence to never being in the second category again. By the time he reached the heights of Soviet power, by the time the name Stalin was known across the world, the boy who had been beaten by his father had constructed the most elaborate system of control in human history. Psychologists who have studied his case note the pattern: childhood trauma, combined with exceptional intelligence, combined with complete lack of empathy, combined with access to absolute power. This combination does not always produce monsters, but when it does, the monsters it produces are very particular ones. They are people who understand human vulnerability because they have lived it, who understand how fear works because they have felt it, who understand how to make people need you because they once needed others and found that need unbearable. There is a woman whose story you need to know. Her name was Nadezhda Mandelstam. Her husband was Osip Mandelstam, one of the greatest Russian poets of the 20th century. In 1933, Osip Mandelstam wrote a short poem, 16 lines, about Stalin. He never published it. He recited it to a small circle of friends in a private apartment. In a whisper, one of those friends informed, the secret police came for Osip Mandelstam in 1934, and again in 1938. The second time, he did not come back. He died in a transit camp outside Vladivostok, of cold, of typhus, of the systematic destruction of a man by a state. Nadezhda survived, and in the years after Stalin's death, she wrote 2 memoirs that are among the most important documents in the literature of the 20th century. She described what it was like to live inside that system, from the inside, as an ordinary person. She described the sound of the elevator in her building at night, and how everyone who heard it listened to hear which floor it would stop at. She described the particular way a person holds their face when they have learned that their expression can condemn them, a kind of permanent neutrality, not calm exactly, but the performance of calm. She described watching friends disappear and the process by which those friends were unmemorialized, first by strangers, then by acquaintances, then by close friends, and finally, by herself. Because to remember a person who had been arrested was to associate yourself with an enemy, and association was enough. She described the moment she understood the purpose of all of it. It wasn't the arrests, she wrote. It wasn't the camps. The real purpose was silence. The real victory was the silence of the survivors. That sentence, the real victory was the silence of the survivors, is among the most precise descriptions of authoritarian psychology ever written. Because the dead do not threaten. The dead cannot organize, cannot communicate, cannot pass memory to children. But the living who choose silence, the living who choose to forget, the living who pretend that nothing happened, they complete the work that the arrests began. They erase themselves, voluntarily, from their own history. Nadezhda Mandelstam refused this. She memorized her husband's poems, physically memorized them, because she did not trust paper, did not trust walls, did not trust anyone. And she carried those poems in her memory through the years of terror, through the years of silence after, through decades of internal exile and poverty, until finally, the world changed enough that she could write it all down and place it where it cannot be erased. There is one more element of Stalin's psychological system that is rarely discussed, but may be the most important. He understood grief, and he weaponized it. When someone was arrested, their family was left in a particular condition. They could not grieve publicly, because to grieve was to express that a loss had occurred. And a loss could only occur if the person arrested had been innocent, and innocent people were not arrested. So the grief had nowhere to go, no funeral, no public mourning, no acknowledgement that anything had been lost. The family was required to behave as though the person had simply ceased. This is one of the cruelest psychological torments imaginable, because grief is a biological process. It requires expression to move through its stages. Denied expression. It does not disappear. It compresses. It becomes something else. It becomes a permanent wound that cannot heal because it cannot be named. People of the arrested learn to perform an extraordinary act of psychological self-surgery. They excise the memory of the person, from their own internal life, from their dinner table conversation, from their plans for the future, from the photographs on the walls, not because they stopped loving them, but because love had become dangerous. Children grew up not knowing their parents had a sibling who had disappeared, not knowing their grandparents had lost children, because the silence around those losses was so complete, so enforced, that the family itself had absorbed it as natural. Psychiatrists who worked in the former Soviet Union after its collapse documented the multi-generational impact of this enforced silence. They found that trauma transmitted across generations, not just through behavior, but through silence, through the specific way certain topics were avoided, certain names never mentioned, certain questions never asked. The children and grandchildren of the terror carried wounds they could not name because they had never been told what had caused them. This is the true measure of what Stalin built. Not the number of people killed, though that number is staggering. The true measure is the silence. The enforced forgetting, the grief with nowhere to go, that traveled through families, through decades, and arrived in the present day as a weight that people carry without knowing why. You might ask, what does any of this have to do with us? Here, today, in a country with a Bill of Rights and free elections and an open internet? The honest answer is, more than we are comfortable acknowledging. Not because America is becoming the Soviet Union, it is not, but because the psychological mechanisms Stalin used are not foreign to the human condition. They are native to it. Every family contains the seeds of the cult of personality. The parent whose approval is the only approval that matters, whose reality is the only permitted reality, whose anger reshapes what everyone around them remembers. Every workplace contains the seeds of the show trial, the public shaming, the enforced condemnation of the accused, the pressure to participate or be suspected. Every community contains the seeds of the informer network. The culture in which reporting your neighbor earns approval, earns standing, earns safety. We are not immune to these mechanisms. We are human, and these mechanisms run on human psychology. What we have that Stalin's subjects did not have is information. We can name these things: learned helplessness, manufactured consent, Stockholm syndrome, the foot-in-the-door technique, cognitive reframing, chronic threat response. When you can name them, you can see them operating in your own life, in your community, in the institutions you are part of, in the media you consume, in the relationships that shape you. That is the gift of history. Not nostalgia, not tribalism, not the comfort of a story about people far away in a different time. The gift of history is the map. The map that shows where the traps are, so that you do not have to discover them personally. Stalin spent 30 years building a system designed to make people helpless, to make them afraid of their own thoughts, to make them need him. The best response to that legacy is not anger, though anger is understandable. The best response is understanding. Clear, honest, unflinching understanding of how these systems work, of what they cost, of what resisting them actually requires. It requires the things that Stalin worked hardest to destroy: trust, genuine connection, the willingness to say what you actually think, to friends who can handle it, in spaces that are genuinely private. It requires the things Nadezhda Mandelstam demonstrated: the decision to remember, even when forgetting would be easier, even when remembering is painful, even when the world tells you that what you remember didn't happen the way you remember it. And it requires the thing that the people who applauded for 11 minutes in that Moscow hall were not able to do: the courage to sit down. First, that is the final lesson of Stalin's dark psychology. Not what was done to people, but what people can choose to do instead. It is 3 a.m. in Moscow, 1938, a specific building on a specific street. The building is a good one, reserved for academics and engineers, people who are useful, people who have been given something worth losing. A family is asleep. A man, his wife, their 2 children. The knock comes at 3:15. The man does not need to be told what the knock means. Everyone knew what that knock meant. Everyone had been waiting for it. Not because they had done anything wrong, but because the knock had become the background rhythm of Moscow life. He dresses quickly. He has prepared a small bag, weeks ago, because preparation is what you do when you understand the system you live inside. Toothbrush, a change of clothes, a small amount of food. His wife stands in the doorway of the bedroom, not crying, because crying would frighten the children, and the children are in the doorway behind her, wide-eyed, old enough to understand, too young to understand. The agents are polite. They are always polite. Politeness is part of the system, because visible brutality creates solidarity. Politeness creates confusion. Confusion is safer for the state. They show papers. They give him time to say goodbye, a controlled amount of time, enough to be humane in appearance, not enough to plan, not enough to communicate. He holds his daughter for approximately 45 seconds. He holds his son for approximately 30 seconds. He kisses his wife. He does not say, "I am innocent," because there is no one to say it to. He does not say this is wrong, because there is no framework in which wrong means anything operative anymore. He says, "Take care of each other." And he walks out the door between the two polite agents, and the door closes. His wife stands in the apartment, listening to the elevator. In the morning, she will go to work, because not going to work will be noticed. She will answer questions about where her husband is with a careful, neutral face. She will say she does not know, which is true. She will not cry at her desk, because crying would suggest she believes something unjust has happened. And believing something unjust has happened is itself dangerous. She will go home, feed her children, put them to bed, and then she will sit in the kitchen, in the apartment they shared, in the silence where he used to be. And she will feel something for which the Russian language has a word, and for which English does not have an exact equivalent. A word that means the grief you cannot speak, the loss you cannot name, the absence of a person who has been officially erased. She will feel this every day, for the rest of her life. This is what authoritarian psychology costs. Not only the people it arrests, but the people it leaves behind, in the apartments, with the children, in the silence, at 3 a.m, when the elevator stops on someone else's floor, and you realize it is not you tonight, and you feel something you cannot name about that, something that is not quite relief, something that will not let you sleep. This is what 200 million people lived with, every day, for decades. And this is why understanding how it was built, understanding the specific psychological mechanisms that made it possible, is not merely an academic exercise. It is an act of respect for every person who stood at a door in the dark, saying, "Take care of each other," and walked away. Stalin died on March 5th, 1953. The system he built did not die with him, not immediately, not completely, not even in the decades that followed. Because the psychological damage of totalitarian control is not healed simply by the removal of the controlling authority. The children who grew up learning to hide their thoughts taught their children to do the same. The adults who spent decades trusting no one carried that distrust into a world that had technically changed. The reflex of silence, installed by decades of terror, persisted long after the specific danger that created it had passed. Psychologists who worked with survivors of totalitarian systems documented what they called the authoritarian personality residue, a collection of psychological patterns developed as survival mechanisms under oppression that persisted as dysfunctional habits in freedom: excessive deference to authority, inability to tolerate ambiguity, deep distrust of strangers, preference for strong, centralized leadership, the belief that disagreement is dangerous. These were not character flaws in the people who carried them. They were adaptive responses to genuinely dangerous conditions. The problem was that they did not switch off when the conditions changed. This is the final truth in Stalin's dark psychology. And it is the most important one for us, today, in our own time. The techniques he used were not invented by him. They have appeared in every culture and every century, in families, in workplaces, in communities, in nations, manufactured enemies, control of language, destruction of private space, rewards for betrayal, the elimination of internal criticism, the manufacture of permanent insecurity. We recognize these things, not only in history, but in our present. The value of understanding how Stalin controlled 200 million people is not merely historical. It is personal. It is political. It is the map by which we learn to recognize when these mechanisms are being deployed. Knowledge of the method is the only reliable protection against the method. Because what you can name, you can see. And what you can see, you can resist. That is why this story matters. Not as a monument to one man's evil, but as a record of what the human mind is capable of, both in the service of control and in the service of freedom. The question is always which one we choose to feed. In 1956, 3 years after Stalin's death, Nikita Khrushchev stood before a closed session of the Communist Party Congress and delivered what became known as the secret speech. For 4 hours, he described what Stalin had actually done: the murders, the fabricated confessions, the destruction of loyal party members, the paranoia, the cruelty. The delegates in the room, men who had served Stalin, some who had participated directly in what he was describing, sat in silence. Some wept, some fainted. Several had heart attacks in the weeks that followed. Not because they hadn't known, many had known, but because the official acknowledgement, the naming of it, in a public forum, no matter how controlled, did something that years of private knowledge had not done. It made it real. That is the power of naming, of official acknowledgement, of the public record. Memory that is only held privately can be questioned, can be revised, can be pressured into doubt. Memory that has been named, that exists in documents, in testimony, in the historical record, is harder to erase. This documentary exists in that tradition, the tradition of naming, of saying clearly what happened, and how, and why it worked. Not to frighten, not to despair, but because the only reliable protection against the techniques you have heard described tonight is understanding them. You cannot defend against what you cannot see. You cannot resist what you cannot name. You cannot choose differently if you do not know what the choice actually is. 20 brutal truths about how one man controlled 200 million people. The 21st truth, the one we add ourselves, is this: he could only do it because enough people did not see what was happening until it was too late to stop it. We are seeing it now. If you've stayed with this story to the end, leave a comment with 2 words: dark psychology. And tell us what city you're watching from. We read every single one. We'll see you in the next story.